There are three kinds of men in the West: those running from their past, those who prey on others, and those willing to stand for what's right. Thomas Garrett didn't know which he was until that fateful day. This is a story of courage, redemption, and the price of freedom in Montana Territory, 1870. Grab your whiskey, friends, and join me as Gunsmoke and honor collide. Thomas Garrett stood rock still on his porch, Spencer carbine braced against his shoulder, five armed riders fanned out before him in the yard. His finger rested light on the trigger as he stared down Jackson Cole, whose scarred face twisted into a smirk. "5 guns against 1, Garrett," Cole called. "Those ain't odds I'd bet on." A woman's voice rang out clear as a bell from Thomas's right. "Count again." Eleanor stepped into view. Colt Navy held steady in hands that knew how to use it. Her auburn hair caught fire in the morning sun, her green eyes as hard as Montana flint. "We're not property," came another voice from the cabin window, where Rebecca's pale face appeared above the barrel of a shotgun. "We're free women, and this is our home." Thomas allowed himself the ghost of a smile. 7 months ago, he'd been a lonely man waiting to die. Now he stood between two women and whatever hell was coming for them, and he wouldn't have it any other way. 7 months earlier, the mini ball that tore through Thomas Garrett's thigh at Gettysburg had never truly left him. 7 years later, he still woke some mornings with the phantom whistle of artillery in his ears and the ache deep in his bone. This was such a morning. Thomas stood at his cabin's window, watching dawn break over his 160 acres, land granted under the Homestead Act of '62, small recompense for the 3 years he'd given to the Union cavalry. His weathered hands clutched a coffee mug, knuckles white against the worn tin. The nightmare still clung to him. Sarah's face, flushed with fever, begging him to save their unborn child. Both gone within a day of his return from war. Their graves sat on the low rise behind the cabin, marked by a pair of wooden crosses, weathered gray by Montana winters. The Spencer carbine leaned in the corner, the same rifle he'd carried through Virginia and Tennessee. Some nights, when the silence grew too heavy, he would disassemble it by lamplight, the familiar ritual, the only thing keeping darker thoughts at bay. A hard frost glittered on the grass, and the distant mountains wore caps of early snow. Winter approached, and with it, the need for supplies. Thomas drained his coffee, tucked his wife's wedding ring back beneath his shirt on his leather cord, and limped to the barn. The two draft horses, Caesar and Brutus, nickered as he approached. "Easy, boy," he murmured, running a calloused hand along Caesar's flank. "Town day." As he hitched the team to his wagon, Thomas had no way of knowing this routine supply run would shatter the lonely peace he'd built around himself. Redemption Ridge had sprung up like many frontier towns, hastily built where a trail crossed a river, with more saloons than churches. The main street was hard-packed dirt under a weak autumn sun, storefronts weathered gray against the vast Montana sky. Thomas tied his team outside the general store, nodding briefly to Sheriff Wilson, who stood outside his office. They'd served in the same regiment, though Wilson had escaped with fewer scars, at least on the outside. "Garrett," Wilson called, crossing the street. "Been meaning to ride out to see you." "Something wrong?" Thomas asked, noting the tight lines around the sheriff's eyes. Wilson leaned closer. "Whitaker's got some new merchandise I don't much care for. Raiders hit a settlement near Fort Benton. Women taken." He spat in the dirt. "Law's still gray out here, but doesn't sit right." Thomas's hand instinctively moved to the Colt at his hip. Wilson noticed and shook his head slightly. "Just watch yourself. Cole's boys are in there." The name struck Thomas like a physical blow. Jackson Cole had been a sergeant in a neighboring regiment, discharged for brutality against civilians. The scar bisecting his face had come from an officer's saber after Cole had been caught looting. Thomas pushed open the door to Whitaker's general store. The hinges protested with a long creak that drew the eyes of the half-dozen men gathered in a loose semicircle. Their attention quickly returned to what had held it before. Two women standing against the wall, wrists shackled to a chain bolted shoulder high. The taller woman, perhaps 30, stood with her shoulders back, chin raised in defiance. Auburn hair hung in tangled waves around a face that might have been beautiful before hardship had chiseled it into something stronger. Her green eyes met Thomas's without flinching. Beside her, a smaller woman kept her head down, dark hair falling forward to hide her face. Even from across the room, Thomas could see the fine tremor running through her frame. A flash of memory hit him, Sarah trembling with fever, her fingers clutching his as she slipped away. The world tilted slightly, then righted itself as rage burned through him, cold and clarifying. "Bit late for the auction, Garrett," Whitaker called from behind the counter, his fleshy face split by a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Almost done here." Thomas spotted Cole among the buyers, his scarred face twisted in a smirk. Their eyes met, recognition flaring. "You boys bidding on trouble," Thomas said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "These women belong to themselves." Cole laughed. "Philosophy from a hermit. They're spoils, Garrett. No different than war." Thomas moved closer, his limp more pronounced after the long ride. "What's the paper cost?" he asked Whitaker directly. Whitaker's eyebrows rose. "Chain don't sell separate. You take what's on it." A few men chuckled. One spat tobacco juice into a can with a sharp ping. Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a roll of bills, his savings for winter supplies and seed for spring planting. He peeled them off slowly, laying them on the counter. "Write it up," he said. "Clean." Cole stepped forward, hand dropping to his holster. "Now wait just a—" Sheriff Wilson appeared in the doorway, shotgun cradled in his arms. "Problem here, gentlemen." Whitaker's smile faltered as he counted the money. Thomas took the bill of sale, folded it once, and tucked it into his coat. He stepped to the wall and found the key hanging from a nail. The cuffs opened with a metallic groan. The tall woman's eyes narrowed with suspicion as she rubbed her raw wrists. "Why?" she demanded. "Not here," Thomas replied quietly. "Wagon outside. Blankets, bread, water." She studied him, then nodded once. "Eleanor," she gestured to the smaller woman. "Rebecca." No one spoke as they walked out. Thomas felt the stares burning into his back as they crossed to his wagon. He lifted the chain from their wrists, coiled it twice, and tossed it into the wagon bed before helping them up. As the team pulled away from Redemption Ridge, Cole's voice followed them. "This ain't over, Garrett. A piece of paper don't change what's owed." Thomas kept his eyes on the road, jaw tight, as the town fell away behind them. Only when they'd crested the first rise did he allow himself to exhale. "Those men," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite everything. "They'll come after us." Thomas nodded. "Likely. And then what?" He turned slightly, meeting her gaze. "Then they'll find out what a Spencer carbine can do at 300 yards. The road stretched empty before them, cutting through golden prairie grass bent by the autumn wind. Thomas kept the team at a steady pace, aware of the women's silence behind him. "Why did you do it?" Eleanor finally demanded. Thomas considered his words carefully. "Some things a man can't stand by and watch. And what do you expect in return?" Her voice was sharp as a blade. "Nothing you don't choose to give." He glanced back at her. "I've got a roof, food enough for winter. Come spring, you can go or stay. Your choice." Eleanor's laugh was short and bitter. "Men always say that when they want something later." Thomas felt his jaw tighten. "I buried wanting things with my wife and child 7 years ago." The words hung in the air, unexpected even to himself. Behind him, he heard a small intake of breath from Rebecca. When the homestead came into view, the cabin with smoke curling from the chimney, the weathered barn, the corral where his third horse, a sorrel mare named Penny, nickered a greeting. Thomas felt a strange discomfort. For 5 years, this place had been his alone, as empty and silent as he preferred. Now he was bringing strangers into his sanctuary. He helped them down, noting how Rebecca flinched at his outstretched hand, while Eleanor climbed down on her own. "It ain't fancy," he said, shouldering their small bundle of belongings, "but it's dry, and the stove keeps it warm." Inside, the cabin smelled of wood smoke and coffee. Thomas led them down the short hallway to two small bedrooms. "You can take these," he said, gesturing to the doors. "Fresh water in the basin, soap on the shelf, lock on the inside." Eleanor arched an eyebrow. "And where will you sleep?" "Got a cot in the main room," Thomas replied. He cleared his throat. "One rule in this house: nobody forces you into anything. Not now, not ever." Eleanor held his gaze, testing for lies. Rebecca glanced up briefly, then back to the floor. Finally, Eleanor gave a short nod. "We'll see," was all she said. Days passed, stretching into weeks. October gave way to November, and the first snow dusted the prairie before melting under the midday sun. To Thomas's surprise, Eleanor joined him in the work without being asked. "I can split wood," she'd said on the third morning, taking the axe from his hands. Her first swing came down clean, splitting the log with a satisfying crack. "Been doing this since I was tall enough to hold an axe," she explained, stacking the halves. For a moment her face softened as the rhythm of the work seemed to loosen something in her. Rebecca emerged more slowly from her shell. Thomas found her in the kitchen one morning, bread dough rising under a cloth. "My mother taught me," she said softly when she caught him looking. It was the most she'd spoken since their arrival. In the evenings, they'd sit at the table, the lamplight throwing long shadows across the cabin walls. At first, the silence hung heavy between them, but gradually words began to fill the space. Eleanor had been a school teacher in Ohio before the war. "Raiders came through our town in '64, she said one night, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. "Took whatever they wanted, including me." Her eyes went distant. "They sold me to a man in St. Louis. I escaped after a year, but got caught again in Kansas." Her laugh was hollow. "Been sold 3 times since then, further west each time." Rebecca's story spilled out in fragments over many evenings. Her family's farm in Tennessee, lost after the war, a promise of household work that had been a lie. "They passed us around like cattle," she whispered, selling us further west each time. One stormy night, when the wind howled around the eaves and snow piled against the cabin walls, Eleanor asked directly about the ring Thomas wore on a cord around his neck. "My wife's," he said after a long pause. "Sarah." He hesitated then. "I was still in Tennessee when the telegram came. Fever had swept through the settlement. By the time I made it back, she was—" He stopped, the words catching. "Our baby, too. Never even got to see him." The cabin fell silent except for the crack of the fire and the moan of the wind. Then Eleanor reached across the table and touched his hand, just briefly. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice gentler than he'd ever heard it. Thomas nodded once. "Wasn't your doing." Later that night, Thomas woke to screams. He bolted upright, Colt in hand, before realizing the sounds came from Eleanor's room. Nightmares. He stood outside her door, uncertain, until the screams subsided into quiet sobs. When he turned to go back to his cot, he found Rebecca watching from her doorway, eyes wide in the darkness. "She dreams of them," Rebecca whispered. "The men who took us." Thomas nodded. "I know something about bad dreams." "Does it ever stop?" she asked, her voice small. He wanted to lie, to offer comfort, but couldn't. "It changes, gets less sharp, but no, it doesn't stop." Rebecca stepped closer, surprising him by taking his hand. "Thank you," she said softly, "for the truth." Something shifted after that night, a measure of trust, tentative but growing. December brought a blizzard that howled for 3 days straight, piling snow against the cabin until the windows were half buried. They were in the barn when it hit, Thomas and Eleanor repairing a stall while Rebecca tended to the horses. By the time they fought their way back to the cabin, the world had disappeared in a swirl of white. Inside, they huddled near the stove, listening to the wind's fury. "Never seen a storm hit so fast," Eleanor said, her face pale despite the exertion. Thomas added wood to the fire. "Montana doesn't give warnings." The blizzard trapped them for days. Food wasn't a concern. Thomas had stocked well, but the confinement wore on them all. By the third day, Thomas's leg ached fiercely, the old wound protesting the cold and damp. Eleanor noticed his stiffness as he rose from the table. "Sit," she ordered, gesturing to his chair. Before he could protest, she knelt and began kneading the twisted muscle around his knee. "My father had a war wound," she explained, her strong fingers finding knots of pain he hadn't realized were there. "Shiloh taught me how to work the muscles when they seized." Thomas sat rigid at first, unused to being touched. Gradually, the pain eased under her skilled hands. Rebecca watched from across the room, her dark eyes thoughtful. Later, when Eleanor stepped outside to check the storm's progress, she approached him. "She's different with you," Rebecca said quietly. "Less angry." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Still plenty angry." Rebecca smiled, a rare sight that transformed her solemn face. "She trusted no one when we were before, but she trusts you." "And you?" Thomas asked. "Do you trust me?" She considered the question seriously. "I'm learning how." On the fourth day, the storm finally broke. They emerged to a world transformed, drifts higher than a man's head, the landscape sculpted into unfamiliar shapes. As they dug paths to the barn, Eleanor suddenly stopped, staring at the horizon. "Riders," she said, her voice tight. Thomas followed her gaze, spotting the dark shapes moving against the white. His hand went to his hip, but he'd left the colt inside. "Get to the house," he ordered, but Eleanor stood her ground. "No more running," she said firmly. "No more hiding." As the riders drew closer, Thomas recognized Sheriff Wilson and another man from town. "Garrett," Wilson called, reining in. "Thought you might need checking on after that blow." Thomas relaxed slightly. "We managed." Wilson's eyes moved to Eleanor, then back to Thomas. "Got news you should hear. Cole and his boys robbed the bank in Helena, shot the teller." He leaned forward in his saddle. "They're saying they're headed this way, looking for what's owed them." Thomas felt ice that had nothing to do with the weather. When? Could be days. Could be longer with these drifts. Wilson straightened. "Thought you should know." After they'd ridden off, Eleanor turned to Thomas, her face grim. "You could give us back. Save yourself the trouble." Thomas met her gaze steadily. "That what you want?" "No," she replied without hesitation. "But I don't want your death on my conscience either." "Then we'd best get ready," Thomas said, "because I'm not giving anyone up, and I'm not planning on dying." "Again," Thomas ordered, watching Eleanor take aim at the row of bottles he'd set on the fence. The colt bucked in her hand, and another bottle exploded. "You've done this before," he observed. Eleanor lowered the gun, a grim smile touching her lips. "My second owner thought it amusing to teach his property to shoot. Less amusing when I turned the gun on him." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You kill him?" "No, shot wide on purpose, but it bought me time to run." She raised the colt again. "I won't miss this time." Rebecca proved a quicker study than either expected. Her hands were steady on the shotgun, her eye keen. "My brothers hunted," she explained, successfully hitting a target for the third time. "Pa never let me join, but I watched." In the evenings, Thomas showed them how to clean the weapons, the importance of keeping powder dry, how to calculate windage and drop over distance. They listened intently, asking questions, absorbing everything. They'll come from the south, Thomas explained over a rough map drawn on the table. Trails easier, especially with snow. We'll have warning. And if there are too many? Rebecca asked quietly. Thomas met her gaze. Then we make each shot count. As January yielded to February, and February to March, they settled into a routine. Work during the day, endless in winter, and preparation for what they all knew was coming. The cabin that had once echoed with Thomas's solitude now hummed with life and purpose. One night, as Thomas sat cleaning his Spencer by lamplight, Eleanor joined him at the table. Without a word, she took the ramrod from his hands, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The touch lingered, deliberate. "If I die when they come," she said quietly, "I want you to know something." Thomas looked up, meeting her gaze. "These months here, they're the first time since the war I've felt like a person instead of a thing." Her green eyes held his. "That's worth fighting for." Before he could respond, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his, brief but fierce. Then she was gone, leaving him staring after her. From the shadows of the hallway, Rebecca watched, her expression unreadable in the dim light. April brought the first true thaw, snow retreating to reveal muddy earth in the pale green shoots of new grass. Thomas was mending a fence when he spotted the rider approaching from the east, not the south where they'd been watching for Cole. He recognized Penny's distinctive canter before he could make out the rider. Eleanor, returning from checking their southern sightline. She rode hard, pushing the mare faster than was wise in the muddy conditions. Thomas dropped his tools and limped toward the corral, hand on his colt. Eleanor reined in sharply, Penny's sides heaving. "They're coming!" she gasped. "5 riders! Cole's leading them, armed like they mean war." Thomas nodded, oddly calm now that the waiting was over. "How far?" "Hour, maybe less." They stopped at the creek to water their horses. Rebecca appeared in the cabin doorway, face pale but determined. Without being told, she went to fetch the shotgun. "You could still leave," Thomas said to Eleanor. "Both of you. Take the horses, head north to Fort Benton. I'll hold them here." Eleanor dismounted, her boots hitting the mud with a soft squelch. She stepped close, her face tilted up to his. "No," she said simply. "This is our home, too." The word home struck Thomas like a physical blow. Home. Not just his anymore, but theirs. Something to defend together. "Then we'd best get ready," he said softly. Thomas stood rock still on his porch, Spencer carbine braced against his shoulder. 5 armed riders fanned out before him in the yard. His finger rested light on the trigger as he stared down Jackson Cole, whose scarred face twisted into a smirk. "5 guns against 1, Garrett," Cole called. "Those ain't odds I'd bet on." A woman's voice rang out clear as a bell from Thomas's right. "Count again." Eleanor stepped into view. Colt Navy held steady in hands that knew how to use it. Her auburn hair caught fire in the morning sun, her green eyes as hard as Montana flint. "We're not property," came another voice from the cabin window, where Rebecca's pale face appeared above the barrel of a shotgun. "We're free women, and this is our home." Cole's smirk faltered as he glanced at his men, who shifted uneasily in their saddles. "That paper you bought?" "Worthless," Cole spat. "These women were promised to me before Whitaker ever got his hands on them. Helena Bank paid me in blood. Your blood's next, Garrett." Thomas's voice was steady as stone. "Last chance to ride away, Cole." Cole's hand dropped to his holster. "Take 'em." The world exploded into sound and smoke. Thomas fired first, the Spencer's report deafening as Cole's shoulder jerked back, his shot going wild. Eleanor's colt barked twice, dropping another rider whose horse reared in panic. Rebecca's shotgun boomed from the window, the scatter catching a third man across the chest. He tumbled from the saddle with a cry. The remaining 2 riders wheeled their horses, firing wildly as they retreated. One bullet splintered the porch post inches from Thomas's head. Another caught him a glancing blow across his right arm, burning like fire. Cole struggled to control his horse with his good arm, his face contorted with rage. "This ain't over," he shouted as they galloped away. Silence fell, broken only by the ringing in Thomas's ears and the panicked whinnies of the abandoned horses. Gun smoke hung in the air, acrid and thick. Eleanor lowered her Colt, her hand trembling slightly now that the danger had passed. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, shotgun still clutched in white-knuckled hands. "You're hit," Eleanor said, spotting the blood soaking Thomas's sleeve. "Just a graze," he replied, though the pain was sharpening now that the fight was over. Eleanor took his arm, guiding him inside where Rebecca already had water boiling and bandages ready. As she cleaned the wound, her touch gentle despite her trembling hands, Thomas studied her face. "You've done this before too," he observed. A shadow crossed her eyes. "Too many times." Later, when the wound was bandaged and a shot of whiskey had dulled the worst of the pain, Thomas stepped back onto the porch. The bodies had been buried on the far side of the creek, the spooked horses corralled. Eleanor joined him, her shoulder brushing his as they watched the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. "They'll be back," she said quietly. Thomas nodded. "With more men likely." And then he turned to her, seeing not just Eleanor but Rebecca standing in the doorway behind them. Two women who had come to him in chains and now stood as his equals, as his family. "Then we stand together," he said, "like today." Eleanor's hand found his, fingers intertwining. "Together," she agreed. Sheriff Wilson rode out a week later, a posse of 6 men at his back. Thomas watched their approach from the porch, Spencer within reach but not in hand. "Garrett," Wilson called as they reined in. "Heard there was trouble." Thomas nodded. "Been handled." Wilson's eyes took in the fresh-turned earth by the creek, the bullet holes in the porch post. "So I see." He dismounted, approaching alone. "Cole's dead. Found him 20 miles south. Bled out from a shoulder wound." Thomas said nothing, aware of Eleanor and Rebecca watching from the doorway. "His remaining men confessed to the Helena robbery," Wilson continued, "and other things. Seems they've been running women west for years, selling them to mining camps, ranches." His eyes flicked to Eleanor and Rebecca. "No one's looking to press charges here, Garrett. Way most see it, you did the territory a service." Relief washed through Thomas, though he kept his face impassive. "Appreciate the news, Sheriff." Wilson hesitated, then added, "There's talk in town about your arrangement here." Thomas straightened, his hand dropping closer to his holster. "That's so." Wilson raised a placating hand. "No law against it, Garrett. Just thought you should know people talk." "Let them," Thomas replied. "Doesn't change anything." After the posse rode off, the three of them sat on the porch, watching twilight gather over the mountains. Eleanor leaned against Thomas's good arm, her head on his shoulder. Rebecca sat on his other side, close enough that he could feel her warmth. "What now?" Rebecca asked softly. Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 small silver circles, holding them in his palm. They gleamed in the fading light, 3 rings fashioned from a silver dollar, each etched with a single word: freedom. "Your choice," he said. "Always your choice." Eleanor took 1 ring, slipping it onto her finger. Rebecca took another, tears glistening in her eyes. Thomas closed his hand around the 3rd ring. "No preacher, no paper, just us choosing each other." "That's all we need," Eleanor said firmly. As spring yielded to summer, the homestead transformed. A garden flourished behind the cabin, tended by Rebecca's careful hands. Eleanor began teaching the children from neighboring farms, gathering them under the old oak tree 3 days a week, and Thomas found himself smiling more often than not, the weight he'd carried since Gettysburg finally beginning to lift. At night, he no longer slept alone on his cot in the main room. Instead, he shared the master bedroom, sometimes with Eleanor, sometimes with Rebecca, sometimes with both. Their arrangement raised eyebrows, but in a land where survival demanded flexibility, judgment remained largely unspoken. Freedom, Thomas had learned, wasn't just the absence of chains. It was the right to choose your own path, to build something worth protecting, to love without boundaries. As he watched Eleanor and Rebecca moving through the garden one golden evening, laughing together in the sunset light, he knew he'd found something more precious than any homestead grant, more valuable than all the gold in Montana territory. He'd found home. Thank you for riding along with me through the story of Thomas, Eleanor, and Rebecca. In many ways, their journey mirrors what our generation understands better than most, that life's greatest battles aren't always fought with guns, but with conviction and character. I hope this tale took you back to a time when America was still being shaped by ordinary people making extraordinary choices. If Thomas Garrett's quiet strength or Eleanor's fierce determination resonated with you, let me know in the comments below. I'm curious, what would you have done in Thomas's position that day at Whitaker's store? Have you ever had to stand your ground to protect something that mattered, even when the odds were stacked against you? Before you go, if you appreciated this journey to Montana territory of 1870, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. I've got stories from the Civil War, the Gold Rush, and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad coming up that I think you'll find worth your time. And if you know a friend who appreciates tales of the America that shaped us, the America of grit, principle, and second chances, share this video with them. After all, good stories, like good whiskey, are meant to be shared. Until our trails cross again next Wednesday, this is Frontier Chronicles signing off. Stay strong, stand tall, and remember, we come from people who didn't back down when it mattered.